Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Clore, again, member of the Textile Arts Council Board. Welcome to our fourth and last in the TAC Virtual Travel Series, The Arts and Crafts Heritage of William and May Morris. It may be the last of this series, but it's not the last of our programming. Starting next month, we'll have our monthly lecture series. Our first program will be Youth Voice Through Textiles. The executive director of the of the Social Justice Sewing Academy will share how youth uses quilting as a platform for personal expression. SJSA teaches young people to use textile media to advocate for social justice and melds artistic expression with activism, something with which I think William and May Morris would both highly agree. And you can see from the images on the slide how powerful the quilts are that they make. Today, we are going to meet in depth May Morris. May Morris, I found her obituary from the New York Times, and the heading is Miss May Morris, editor of works of her father, William Morris, the poet. So different time when different things were important. It also continues, she also had an important position with an embroidery manufacturing firm. To quote Jan Marsh, her biographer, and Anna Mason, curator, May Morris was a talented designer and maker and made a unique contribution to the international development of art embroidery, always overshadowed by her illustrious father and also by her mother's reputation as a pre-Raphaelite muse. May Morris is just beginning to receive the attention her own achievements deserve. So today we will help May take her place as a designer, educator, and innovator of the arts and crafts style. Our speaker today is Lucy Barter, the founder and lead instructor for the San Francisco School of Needlework and Design. I met Lucy by chance about 10 years ago. I sat next to her on a Southwest flight. She was on her way to St. Louis. She had graduated from the Royal School of Needlework apprenticeship program and was flying across the country teaching for the RSN, as well as coordinating all of their courses in the United States. Since then, she has founded the San Francisco School of Needlework and Design and is now their lead instructor. Lucy welcomes the opportunity to flex her creative stitching fingers and develop new classes, which she so kindly did for TAC. We had another great workshop yesterday and I greatly appreciate it. Our housekeeping notes, our program is best viewed in full screen mode and we will be using the Q&A function to answer your questions. So welcome, Lucy Barter.
Hello, Ellen. And thank you very much for that introduction. I did not realize I was sat next to you on that plane all those years ago. Thank you for reminding me. So welcome, and I'm going to be presenting this presentation on May Morris. Let's get my screen up there. So May Morris elevated the status of embroidery as an art form. She was the driving force of her generation to do so. Born Mary Morris on May 25th in 1862 at the Red House in Bexley Heath, Kent, she was known through her life as May. May was the younger daughter of William and Jane Morris. She had an older sister, Jenny, who was also an accomplished embroiderer. May grew up in an environment where there was a daily focus on craft work. As her parents moved in artistic circles, and they were also important figures themselves in the art world, she was surrounded by artistic influences from painters, architects, poets, and writers. Dante Gabriele Rossetti sketched May and her sister, Jenny, as young girls. Her embroidery education started at the knee of her mother, Jane, and Jane's sister, Elizabeth Burden, who taught at the Royal School of Art Needlework, now known as the RSN, in the 1870s. William Morris embroidered himself. With May witnessing and influenced by her family embroidering, it was instilled in her. In a 1910 interview given to the American press, May recalled, "Embroidery is the first thing I learned. I sat beside my mother at her embroidery frame and watched the needle come down and begged to allow it to fasten the thread." As a young girl, May recorded her holidays and items of interest in journals. It was said she paid a lot of attention to flowers more so than to people. The embroideries and the tapestries she would create later in life are full of English hedgerow flowers and colours and lines inspired by meadows, landscapes, paintings, and nature. May has her hands resting on the frame in this photograph in careful contemplation of where she's placing her threads and her needle. It was important to do that and sit back often when stitching so that you take the piece in from a distance. It's also important, as you can see, to sit in good lighting. In the autumn of 1878, May studied on a rigorous 3-year training course in needlework and drawing at the National Art Training School in South Kensington, London. The course was practical, but also covered historical research and design. May knew she was fortunate to have this apprenticeship opportunity. The training school was located near South Kensington Museum, renamed Victoria and Albert Museum in 1899. Here she could enjoy the treasures of the collections with many medieval textiles among them. The study of these textiles were to play an important role in May's approach to design and her skill set. May's future work would reflect historical knowledge of different eras and styles of embroidery from these studies she made. At this time, a technical art school education was becoming increasingly important for those entering the textile industry, and formal education began to replace more traditional systems of learning and handcrafts. When I studied fashion design, and later when I studied at the Royal School of Needlework on the apprenticeship, I spent many hours myself walking the halls of the B&A. May extensively studied the works of Opus Anglicanum, medieval embroidery of the 13th and 14th centuries. It greatly influenced her work as a designer, but also in the work she published. In a publication on needlework printed in 1885, she wrote, "I am inclined to take needle art seriously." She championed for work of former times, considering embroidery just as important as any other art form to study from. She chose a detail from this cope, the Jessie cope, pictured in this slide, as the frontpiece to her 1893 book, Decorative Needle. The cope is embroidered with silver gilt and silver thread, along with coloured silks and underside couching, and split stitch, with laid and couched work on a silk twill. May's love of early work can be traced back to the church architect, George Edmund Street, to whom her father, William Morris, had apprenticed with in 1856. In her book, Decorative Needle, she writes, "Modern embroidery does not compare favourably with that of any period, but it is the very antithesis to the early art, and in indeed time that something was done to raise it to a higher level." May regarded the Scion cope as one of the finest examples of Opus Anglicanum. On her visits to see it, she thought it lived in a twilight corner at the South Kensington Museum, suitable to its delicate constitution. She thought it to be instinct with life and originality. In the image of the orphery that you see, I think you can see the influence of not only the stitches May enjoyed researching, but the simple shading of split stitch in only 2 to 3 shades. Also, the composition of this piece. May used symmetry a lot in her design work, and carefully framed designs with borders which were beautifully designed themselves. Keep this image in mind as we go through the slides today. 30 years after the start of Morris & Company in 1875, May was still appealing to the embroiderer to look to the Middle Ages for inspiration and advised readers to avoid modern work and study at the South Kensington Museum's medieval collection. And by modern work, May was referring to Berlin woolwork. The Victorian obsession with Berlin woolwork had eclipsed most other forms of embroidery. William Morris thought it was responsible for the decline in needle skills. The technique is stitched on a stiff canvas using cross stitch and tent stitches to shade it in with bright synthetic colours. Patterns were produced in the thousands and were very flamboyant in design. May did not like machine mass production or the look and function of Berlin woolwork. She inherited the devotion to meticulous skill in working a single piece from her father. William Morris championed art needlework through his firm Morris & Co. He was a key figure in the arts and crafts movement that began in Britain around 1880, which then spread to North America and beyond. Art needlework was all about good design and the quality and careful consideration of the materials used. It combined skill and the play of stitches. The fibers were naturally dyed, wools and silks, that when placed together created subtle shadings. Gold threads were used in couching, as inspired by the medieval embroideries both May and Morris studied. Traditional stitches were used, but not many: long and short, satin stitch, stem stitch, split stitch, French knots, darning and couching. It was encouraged to express oneself with freehand stitching and delicate shading, unlike in Berlin woolwork. May travelled around churches in England and abroad, including France and Italy, to study embroidery. Both her and her father emphasised the importance of examining embroidery from different countries and periods in order to understand the materials used and the effects achieved. May bequeathed to the Birmingham Museum of Art Gallery a group of embroideries ranging from 16th century Italian to mid-19th century Turkish work she had collected. Exhibitions at the time helped to showcase the revival and historic interest in historic needlework. Her commitment to study of embroidery saw her keep a record of work she was yet to explore and study herself. I'm sure we've all got a book listing those places we'd like to visit. The resemblance in this slide of the flower pot to this Turkish towel is evident. I happened upon this Turkish towel fragment in my research, but it is very similar and striking to this flower pot embroidery, down to even the colours used. And one of the stitches that was used widely in the arts and crafts movement and in May's work was a stitch known as speckling, which we actually teach and call seeding today. From the studies May did on how needlework was created and how it was used in domestic as well as church settings during the Middle Ages, she was able to successfully design and work striking pieces herself. She also consulted the work of modern scholars and acknowledged their research in their writings. She was respected as a connoisseur of medieval embroidery by her contemporaries and worked with many on different commissions, such as this superfrontal designed by Philip Webb. Embroidered by May and stitched in silk and gold thread, probably on a linen ground, it was worked in long and short stitch, split stitch, French knots with bayot stitch and couched gold work. Bayot stitch is a form of laid work, and it would cover large areas of fabric quite easily with long threads, but it would need to be couched down to hold it safely. Embroidery became recognized as an expressive craft that allowed for individuality to be explored. The arts and crafts movement principles were about belief in materials, structure, and function. Simple forms and motifs were favoured were from nature. By adopting a conscious design approach to embroidery, May elevated its status from domestic pastime to serious art form. May was known for her use of colour. She wrote in the Arts and Crafts essay in 1903, "Colour cannot be too bright in itself. If it appears so, it is the skill of the craftsman that is at fault." She goes on to talk about how colour should not disturb the eye, but the general effect is that of a subdued glow. The qualities of colours used to create harmony and crispness in embroidery are key. Her favourite colour was blue, one of the pleasantest to have constantly have under one's eye. If you note in this picture, the beautiful sketches, the colour plans, it's very important to have a good design stitch plan before setting out on embroidering the actual piece. Two factors dominate May's work: the crucial importance of a well-constructed design and the relationship between design and the appropriate materials used. The work shall not be meaningless, but rather a thing of use and individual interest, she wrote. May combined instruction on executing stitches and the care of materials with advice on the integration of stitches, colour, and structure. She wrote, "The given space must be filled by forms in a certain rhythmical sequence, which may be either masked or plainly marked. And your work should on a whole be very flat and quiet in general character, though as bright as you can get the individual tones." In many of her works, she uses a handful of stitches, and in some she would use one stitch primarily, showcasing her skill as interpreting a naturalistic finish. In decorative needlework, May recommends using simple stitches over exotic and difficult needlework. Design, she wrote, above all, was the very essence and soul of beautiful embroidery. Her approach and essence of her own work clearly is influenced a whole generation at the turn of the century, notably people Mary Newhall, Grace Christie, Jessie Newbury, and the Glasgow School. In this screen, we see the use of just a couple of stitches, and we've used one of our diagrams from our kits that we teach in our classes to indicate stem stitch. This is a great outlining stitch, but it can be used row upon row to create really beautiful subtle shading, as you see in the scrolling leaves of this screen. In 1885, at the age of 23 years old, May took over the embroidery department of her father's business, Morris & Co. Her father had confidence in her abilities, and as the embroidery department was one of the most important in the firm, he felt that May's artistic gifts could contribute much to Morris & Co., as was proved. She did not move the company forward. Instead, she focused on keeping the Morrison look. May's ability to design was an important factor in her success as a manageress of the embroidery department. A number of needlewomen recruited from local schools worked under May's supervision at her home at 8 Hammersmith Terrace. She supervised much of the work for the embroidery department in her drawing room. This was the room we saw her sitting in the earlier slides. From the department, small items for domestic use proved to be very popular, particularly when sold as kits to be stitched by the customer. As illustrated in this image of Olive and Rose, designed by William Morris, the unfinished piece, and a Tudor rose kit designed by May and stitched by Alice Mary Godman, customers could choose a kit with thread included and a design drawn on the backing fabric. Some kits varied in design slightly in colorways, but also bespoke options were offered too. May's work is best known through the panels, wall hangings, and bed covers made for Morris & Co., many of which she designed. Her private work of her own designs and those of artist friends she collaborated with tend to be more delicate in colouring and detail to those from Morris & Co. May's own work shows a stylistic development away from the restraints of the company, and the influence from early William Morris embroideries. Her designs were often symmetrically structured and had many elements composed within a bold frame. In some designs, she incorporated stylized birds and animals, preferring to use the suggestion of naturalism in the work rather than anything too abstract. In her words, "The first thing a designer will do is go to the natural growths and animals of life. The artist should study the beauty found there and then work with the findings, but his own work should merely recall nature, not absolutely copy it." When it came to designing works of embroidery, both William and May agreed that shading should be avoided. Instead, William Morris instructed designers to combine clearness of form and firmness of structure with the mystery which comes of abundance and richness of detail. While May felt even more strongly that needle painting was a danger, as it tempted some to produce highly shaded imitations of pictures. In this slide, we have Theodosia Middlemore stitching her version of the fruit garden, which is the hanging you see in blue. And the green one is stitched by May herself. There are certain subtle differences between these two, one being the colours and the stitches used, and also the mottos at the top of the panels, each read differently. The fruit garden, or orchard portrait, is one of May's most popular designs, and this is a close-up detail of the slide we just saw previously. The day book of Morris & Co. was a handwritten ledger that May kept at the embroidery department. It shows that no less than 5 versions of this hanging were made in 1893 alone. One would be about 14.5 weeks of work and cost £48 when sold fully completed. In today's money, that works out to be about $8,156. The day book records the volume of business undertaken by the embroidery department between 1892 and 1896. The notes made in the book reflect trends in popularity of different designs and products. It also reveals labour times and costs for both designing and completing the orders. In the slide detail, you'll see that May has signed the piece of work with her initials MM, a few inches from the left above the brown stitched border. It is more textured due to the amount of different stitches used, including stem stitch, couching, darning stitch, herringbone, pistol stitches, and buttonhole. Here we see rows of stem and in the big leaf, darning stitch. May Morris felt that work should have life and meaning, and she achieved this more and more as an independent designer. Although the birds and trees and animals in her work became more stylized, she was able to capture movement, and the choice of colors is so expressive. There were still similarities with her father's work, such as the use of unworked ground fabric as a flat surface behind the design, without perspective, but she developed his ideas and added her own touches. She also seems to have taken inspiration from other products being designed at Morris & Co. to encourage her to enhance her embroideries. She used inscriptions in many of her works, something which was only found in William's tapestries. She also used motifs linked into network patterns, much like William Morris's wallpaper and carpet designs. The design in this slide is unusual as the ground is entirely covered with stitch. May has filled this piece with birds, trees, animals, flowers, vines, and heraldic shields. It's 74 inches long and 116.5 inches wide, which makes it one of the largest and most ambitious designs. Hopefully you agree that the composition is a success. May published many articles and essays as a designer and teacher. In 1888, Chain Stitch Embroidery was published in the Hobby Horse Volume 3. In 1892, she publishes an essay, Embroidery in Plain Handicrafts. To follow, in 1893, was her book, Decorative Needle, written as a beginner's guide to embroidery. At this time, May was becoming well known and her career was firmly established. The book was intended as a supplement to practical instruction. It covers embroidery design, philosophies, accounts of how stitches are to be worked along, with diagrams and plenty of advice. The section in the text on design and colour clearly explains her approach to embroidery as illustrated in her works. May designed the binding with a dainty repeat pattern. The cover was blocked in gold on 125 special copies. This is my personal copy on loan to Snad's library. It shows the gold glittering and the Jessie Cope as the front piece. Other articles and essays included a 13-part article on churchwork embroidery and a Coptic textiles article. May had travelled to Egypt with her mother, studying textiles, no doubt, on these trips. In 1904, she wrote an essay on decorative art from 1800 to 1885, and she published Opus Anglicanum article in 1905. May was good at designing lettering. With the revival and interest of embroidered book bindings in the 1880s, May, along with her mother, became very interested in stitching them. She designed 15 known examples. Embroidered book bindings were popular in England between the 14th and the mid-17th centuries. Heavily embroidered or embellished with gemstones, they were elaborate and used expensive materials. May visited the British Museum to study historic bindings. She mentions one in her book Decorative Needle and describes it as set with a large flat garnet or ruby. Of the bindings May worked, many were privately commissioned or gifted to friends. They varied from being intricate in design and stitched with silk and gold on silk, and then those of a more simple nature, like this scrapbook cover, worked in silk on linen in just 3 stitches: darning stitch, stem stitch, and satin stitch. And as you can see with the green book cover there was a lot of detail that also went into the spine. The Pomona Tapestry was designed by Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris in 1882. Pomona, the ancient apple queen, represented autumn. It was woven in several versions with differences in each, also in scale. I have my version, that side, from when I was a young girl, hanging up, reproduction, I'm afraid, not the real thing. This version in the slide, however, was embroidered by 3 embroiderers at the Royal School of Art Needlework under the direction and guidance of May Morris and Miss Barker in 1891. In this picture, you will see how the silk thread reflects the light. It is worked in long and short stitches and laid work, which helps the light bounce off the flat appearance of the stitches. The size is very large. It's 117 inches long by 84 inches wide. And the Royal School of Needlework, the art was dropped from their title in 1922, just as a point there. After William Morris died in 1896, and the breakup of her short-lived marriage to Henry Halliday Sparling in 1899, May concentrated on her own needlework, teachings, and writings. May had offered private embroidery classes for half a guinea, but she went on to teach embroidery at the Central School of Arts and Crafts in London between 1897 and 1910. The school charged low fees and concentrated on technical and artistic training of professionals rather than amateurs. She also taught at the Birmingham School of Art between 1899 and 1902, where this owl hanging was designed by the teachers and students a couple of years after her appointment there. It was embroidered by teacher Mary Newell and the students in 1905 to 6. It is said that the embroidery is arranged in this way to allow the students room to embroider and practice the stitches beside each other. It is stitched on wool of Harris linen in many different stitches. The influence of May and her design styles are evident, I feel, in this work. By teaching and lecturing in these schools, May had the chance to educate the students in the technical embroidery standards that she believed in. she felt and also felt were needed, having been lost. The understanding of aesthetic appreciation of embroidery was also very important to her, and she was able to convey this to her students. May would advise her students not to draw a line you do not understand, and I have to say, I think we can all vouch for that. May lectured at a number of British art schools. Her influence can be seen in the works and writings of other embroiderers like Grace Christie, who is published as Mrs. Archibald Christie. May Morris's teaching became legendary. Students who attended the classes went on to become influential designers and craftsmen in their own right, and the teachers of future generations. Her lectures and teachers culminated in her being invited to give a series of lectures in the US. In 1907, May Morris founded the Women's Guild of Arts in reaction to the Arts Workers Guild not accepting women. The first was accepted in 1972. Her aim was to keep the highest level of the arts by which and for which we live, and to create a mutually sustaining atmosphere of camaraderie through meetings and exhibitions. May researched the role of needlewomen and their training throughout history, dating back to medieval times. Many workshops and guilds were in existence in England and France, offering apprenticeships that could last up to as long as 7 years. She hoped to improve the working conditions for women in modern workshops, and this contributed to her forming the Women's Guild. May remained chairman until her death in 1938. She made considerable efforts to improve the standing of women designers. In 1916, the Women's Guild of Art submitted a ladies' bedroom with hangings designed by May to the Arts and Crafts exhibition. The hangings were stitched on wall linen by May and 9 other embroiderers, and this is what you see in these slides. May Morris went on a 7-month lecture tour of America in 1909 to 10. She talked about embroidery and jewelry. She brought with her 16 embroideries and 21 pieces of jewelry. She also showed slides of historic embroidery, including the 2 copes we looked at earlier. She gave lectures about the importance of design. May's itinerary included New York City and Chicago, as well as stops in Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. The tour had been described as grueling, often with stops of only 1 night. Over the holidays, she was relieved to be entertained in New York by lawyer John Quinn, whom she gave this embroidered pouch containing a copy of the Kelmscott Press book. Having set up the Women's Guild a few years before, May took this opportunity to advocate for trade unions in the US and fair pay for makers of handcrafted items. While discussing historical needlework, a summary of her lecture shows that she spoke of the finest medieval embroideries being produced by highly trained men and women in embroiderers' guilds, and not always, as were generally thought, by women in their spare time as a sign of their devotion to domestic life. According to a New York Times review at the time, she also wished to discourage women from undertaking ornamental needlework at prices which put into competition with work done by machinery. May took part in all of the arts and crafts exhibitions, showing work done for Morris & Co. and her own personal work up until 1931. At the 1889 exhibit, 91 of 221 textiles were embroideries. Many of them were from Morris & Co. Fruit tree hanging, shown in 1890, is her finest and most characteristic design for the firm. We saw those slides earlier. From 1889 to 1903, exhibitions showed an increase in hand weaving and other traditional industries. Embroidery was dominated by professional women, showing work that they had designed and stitched, May Morris being one of the most important. These are gloves known as the Easter or Bishop's gloves, designed by Charles Ricketts and embroidered by May Morris in 1899. They were exhibited at least 3 times in May's lifetime. Her work travelled around. The gloves appeared in exhibits in New York and in 1914 in Paris, the year her mother passes. They are made with silk thread and gold braid on linen. The mittens, also designed by Charles Ricketts, are embroidered by May. They were inspired by Elizabethan embroidery, made for a christening of the son of Thomas Sturge Moore, an illustrator, wood graver, and poet. They were exhibited at the Glasgow School of Arts exhibition of ancient and modern embroidery and needlecraft in 1916. In 2017, I went to see the May Morris exhibit at the William Morris Gallery, and these mittens probably were my favourite item I saw that day, that visit, probably due to the career I've had in children's wear design and the fact I have 3 little ones who could wear them myself. In her last year, she lived permanently at Kelmscott Manor in Oxfordshire. It was the country home of William Morris up until his death in 1896. In her father's bedroom, a pair of beautifully designed hangings. They have decorated the beds since 1891. Wool on natural coloured linen, they are in remarkable condition and beautiful examples of work embroidered by May. And it's said a number of friends, including Lily, the sister of W.B. Yeats, worked on them. The valance displays Morris's poem, For a Bed at Kelmscott, composed in 1891. The trellis in the curtains derives from the 1862 design with birds drawn by Philip Webb, which was one of Morris's first for wallpaper. The coverlet displays naturalistic bouquets embroidered by Jane Morris, May's mother. The Kelmscott hangings took 6 hours of design on the border by May, 17 hours of tracing. The embroidery time was 24.5 weeks and 15.5 hours of making, worked by 3 workers in all. May's participation in Morris & Co. ceased in about 1922. The company went into voluntary liquidation on May 21st, 1940, 2 years after her death. May died in 1938 after suffering from influenza. She was still taking on commissions at 76 years old. She was less active towards the end of her life, but still worked as an embroiderer and consultant. This slide shows an embroidery in silk thread on linen that was embroidered in May's final months of her life. It is embroidery of the highest quality. Miss Lobb, May's companion in life later, wrote to the V&A after May's death. You see, William Morris could design embroideries, but could not embroider. Mrs. Morris could embroider, but couldn't design. Miss Morris could and did both design as well as William Morris, and embroider as well as anyone possibly could. And her colour arrangements were approachable and original. This is where Miss Morris excelled, and this is what so few grasp and appreciate. There has been recent interest in the life and works of May Morris as an embroiderer. New books and exhibits showing unseen works for the first time help to shed light on her skills, idealism, and talents. May herself, on reflection of her life, wrote to Bernard Shaw a couple of years before she died. She said, "I am a remarkable woman, always was, though none of you seem to think so." We certainly think so, and just like her students before us who went on to teach and pass on the knowledge she taught them, and through the generations, we find ourselves at the San Francisco School of Needlework and Design, sharing and teaching in a similar vein. We hope in a way that May would approve of. And this exhibit is actually an exhibit that was earlier this year in Scotland. May stood out as a designer, craftswoman, who was able to conceive and execute her own ideas. She leaves a substantial body of work for us to admire and learn from. Her father said he wanted to transform the world with beauty, and he did, in more ways than one. May McCourt, who helped write this lecture today, and I decided to include a slide of our favourite May Morris embroideries. Mine is the spring and summer panel, May stitched between 1895 to 1900, stitched in coloured silk and silk damask, with metal thread couched in her favourite stitches. It has an embroidered motto: "When the summer's gentle season makes leaves and flowers and fields green again." To me, this shows off May's talents as a designer. Her knowledge and technical skill is demonstrated in the stitches and the materials chosen to work with, along with the harmonious colour palette. It encompasses the title of this lecture. It also stamps her name in history as a master in her own right. It inspires me to be a good designer and embroiderer myself. May's favourite is the orange tree panel, as it utilises the bold lines that May Morris espouses in her book. It's simple but very effective and includes May's favourite colour, blue. It is stitched using long and short, stem stitch and French knots. It also includes a background of darning stitches, rather than using coloured fabric. It was central to the arts and crafts movement that the maker take joy in the work, and it seems unlikely that anyone who didn't enjoy embroidery would choose to stitch their background. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was great. We have time for some Q&A now. We have several questions. The first, and actually quite a few of them are technical. How did May transfer her drawings to fabric for later embroidery?
Similar to what we use today. Well, today we use a light box, which is nice and clean, but pricking and pouncing is a method used for transferring fabrics, especially when transferring onto a dark backing ground or to a velvet, for instance. We would create a pricking first.
How do you do the pricking?
The pricking is made by tracing off the design onto a vellum, and then you create little holes all the way through that vellum. And you would use a ground charcoal or what we call a pounce powder to run through the holes. Today we have cleaner methods. We can use something like a pen or a pencil to just run through those. Once you lift the pricking off, you can join the dots.
Very good. When the finished embroidery was removed from the frame, what method was used to flatten or steam the piece?
Well, that could be pressing, and quite often when worked on a slate frame, like you saw in those pictures, or a scroll frame that May was using, the fabric has been pulled so tight, you tend not to have any creases in the backing anyway. So therefore you could go straight into making your hanging.
Have the natural dyes held up in the 100 years since the pieces were made? 104 years.
That's a good question, and I just tidied away all the samples from teaching the classes this week, but we have some samples in our collection here that have a very light and faded effect on the front and the strong colour on the back. So yes, certain dyes, certain colours do not withstand time and light. It's very important to keep your textiles out of direct sunlight, but we have some examples here where they're much brighter on the back than on the front.
In the Pomona hanging, was flat silk or twist used? Do you know?
These, so the silks that May was using were very similar to, I happen to have some just here. This is an example I was showing in class yesterday, where we have beautiful silks. These are a twisted silk here, and very similar to what May Morris would have been using. And I know that she used product from a company called from Thomas Wardle, the Wardle Company, and his wife had founded the Leek Society Embroidery School.
Are the bishop's gloves in leather?
They would have been in a soft leather kit, or most gloves would have been stitched, but I believe these gloves were stitched on a linen ground.
I had a question on the orchard embroidery. It looked to me like the background was brocade or something that, nope, was that all hand stitched too?
So for everyone listening, Ellen did take the class yesterday, and we were talking just before coming on today, and Ellen told me she took out the darning stitches that she had done to replace them, because darning stitch is the stitch that's being used in this background.
Oh, okay. What is wool linen?
A wool linen Did I mention wool linen, or I meant wool stitched on linen? But a wool linen, I'm not sure.
Okay. We also had a question about, is there some Celtic imagery in what you were showing? Would that have been maybe in the early medieval things? Did you see some?
Maybe there's an influence of Celtic, certainly around the medieval time, but not that I evidently saw, certainly through the research that we were doing, putting this lecture together.
And then I have my last question about, you don't have to go on a long time on this, but I just was curious as to how embroidery techniques have changed since May wrote her decorative needlework book.
Well, as we discovered at the beginning of the talk, May was looking at the 14th century for these embroidery techniques, and they really haven't varied much or strayed much from there to today. What we are finding, I think, today is we're still using these stitches, split, stem, laid work, couch work, all these kinds of stitches, but we've got many new fibers to play with and materials, and the application of these stitches may have changed more so, and the design, of course.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Lucy. We enjoyed it so much, and I really appreciate all the time and effort you put into everything you've given to TAC. It's just been great. It's been great to work with you. Really appreciate it very much. Thank you.
We have a good team here at the San Francisco School, and just to let you know, I'm not founder but co-founder of the school, because Elise Ferber, of course, is very much part of our story here.
Great, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.